The Force is light and full of shadows.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive Timelines members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The observation deck of the Invisible Hand smelled of burning metal and scorched flesh. Somewhere below, in the ship's lower corridors, fires were eating through wiring bundles and support struts. The deck groaned beneath Anakin's boots. Through the viewport, Coruscant hung in the middle distance, a city world wrapped in the orange light of late afternoon, utterly indifferent to the violence being committed in its orbit. Anakin didn't look at it. He couldn't look away from what was in front of him. Count Dooku knelt on the deck. His hands, both of them, lay 2 meters to his left. The cauterized stumps at his wrists still trailed thin ribbons of smoke. His breath came in controlled intervals, each exhale precise and deliberate, as though even now, even reduced to this, he was performing composure rather than feeling it. Blood had darkened the front of his cape, where he'd collapsed to one knee. His silver beard was matted against his jaw. He did not beg. He did not speak. 2 blue lightsabers crossed at the base of his throat, close enough that the plasma wash turned the skin above his collar faintly pink. Anakin's arms were steady. His breathing was not. "Do it, Anakin." Chancellor Palpatine's voice came from the elevated throne behind him, still bound by the mag cuffs, still performing the role of captive. Though the cuffs were a formality at this point and everyone in the room could feel it, his voice had changed in the last 30 seconds. Something in it had tightened, like a string drawn too far. Anakin didn't turn around. He is too dangerous to be left alive. A pause. Calibrated. You know what he is. What he's done. How many have died because of him? Geonosis, the droid foundries, Ryloth, the shipping lanes. The list assembled itself in Anakin's mind without effort, each entry a specific weight, a senator's name, a casualty report, a face he'd seen in a HoloNet briefing. Dooku's war. Dooku's architects. The millions of dead that this kneeling man had set in motion with the signature of a commerce treaty. The activation of a droid army, the decision to let the Republic bleed until it consented to its own dismantlement. He is too dangerous. Anakin's grip tightened on both hilts. Then the memory came. It didn't announce itself. It never did. Sand and dark, and the low gurgling sound of a woman who had been hurt past the point where the body could hold on. His mother's face, dry, cracked lips, eyes that found his at the end. The way the grief had cracked something open in his chest, and the rage had poured in to fill it. Hot and clean, and entirely his, and entirely wrong. The Tusken camp in the dark. What he'd done there. The sound of it. What he'd been, for those minutes. What he had promised himself, promised Padme, with her hands on his face and her eyes refusing to look away, that he would never become again. His lightsabers were still crossed at Dooku's throat. Count Dooku had not moved, had not flinched. He was watching Anakin's face the way a scholar reads a difficult text, carefully, without rushing to conclusions. Anakin, Palpatine's voice again. And now the warmth in it was doing something it hadn't done in all their years of fireside conversations and private audiences and careful, patient mentorship. It was pulling. It was pushing. Both at once, dressed as neither. This is war, not a courtroom. You've done harder things. Harder things. He had. He'd done exactly the thing Palpatine was describing, in a camp in the Tatooine desert, and he had lived with it every day since. Not as heroism, as evidence. The lightsabers in his hands came apart. He stepped back. 1 step, then 2. The blue blades stayed lit. He wasn't that certain of his own mercy, but they dropped to his sides, angled down, no longer kissing the skin at Dooku's throat. "No," Anakin said. The word came out quieter than he intended. His voice had a slight tremor in it that he couldn't fully control, and he was too honest with himself in this moment to pretend it wasn't there. This was not a triumphant refusal. It was a man overriding something very loud inside himself, and using the only vocabulary he had left. He's an unarmed prisoner. Anakin kept his eyes forward. He'll stand trial. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Something happened behind him. He didn't see it. He felt it. A fractional shift in the quality of the air, the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm front arrives. A sound that was almost a sound, gone before it could be named. He turned. Palpatine's face had rearranged itself so quickly that Anakin couldn't be certain what he'd missed. What he saw now was what he always saw, the drawn brow of a worried old man. The hands clasped around the mag-cuff chain, the posture of someone who had been very frightened for a very long time and was only just beginning to process his own survival. Anakin, Palpatine's voice had softened again. Concern now, not command. I understand your instincts. You are a good man. But this man is not. We'll take him to the temple first, Anakin said. Then, the council decides. He moved to Dooku, clipping one lightsaber to his belt and keeping the other lit as he reached down and took hold of the Count's upper arm. The man was heavier than he looked. All of that aristocratic posture carried genuine mass, and Anakin pulled him upright with one hand, which wasn't entirely comfortable for either of them, but which established a fact. The prisoner was mobile. The prisoner was alive, and the prisoner was going with them. Dooku allowed himself to be raised to his feet. He stood straight. Even now, stumps for hands, bloodied cape, having just been disarmed and defeated, and very nearly executed, he stood with the bearing of a man who has never once forgotten his own name. His eyes moved to Palpatine. Not to Anakin, not to the viewport, not to the floor. To Palpatine. Anakin was watching Dooku's face. He wasn't sure why he looked for it. Some instinct, some twitch of perception he'd learned over years of reading battlefields, but he watched Count Dooku's expression in the moment his gaze landed on the Chancellor, and what he saw there was not what he expected. He expected hatred. The specific, clarifying hatred of a man who has just been almost executed on another man's command. That was not what he saw. What moved across Dooku's face, slowly, in the way that understanding moves when it arrives too late to be useful, was something far quieter and far more devastating. His eyes tracked the Chancellor's posture, the hands, the particular angle of his jaw, the way the warmth had been reassembled so precisely over the structure of whatever had been underneath it. And the expression that settled into the lines of Dooku's face was the expression of a man who has just understood, completely and without room for revision, exactly how long he has been played for a fool. Not rage. Grief. His eyes did not widen. His breath did not catch. He simply looked at Palpatine with the absolute stillness of a man reckoning with a truth that has retroactively rewritten a decade of his own history, and he said nothing at all. Anakin watched it happen and did not know what he was watching. He would. Later, "We're moving," Anakin said, and turned toward the corridor that led to what remained of the ship's functioning sections. His grip firm on Dooku's arm, his lit blade casting blue across the smoke-stained deck. Behind him, Palpatine followed. He was already speaking again, careful, modulated, the tone of a man redirecting rather than retreating. Dooku walked in silence between them. He did not look back at the viewport, or the city below, or the crossed marks on the deck where his hands had fallen. He was thinking. Whatever it was, it filled his entire face, and none of it reached the surface. Obi-Wan Kenobi woke up on the floor. This was not, in itself, unusual. He had woken on floors before. Desert floors, jungle floors, the floors of crashed gunships and burning transports, and at least one occasion involving a Zygerian slave pen that he preferred not to revisit. What was unusual was the quality of the silence that greeted him. Battle sounds had a texture. Even their absence had one. This silence was too clean, too sudden, which meant either the fighting was over, or he had been unconscious long enough for the fighting to move somewhere he couldn't hear it. He pushed himself upright. His head registered a complaint that started behind his left ear and radiated forward across his temple. He noted it, categorized it as non-critical, and set it aside. The observation deck. The invisible hand. Dooku, he remembered. Obi-Wan turned. Anakin was standing 10 meters away with a lit lightsaber, and his hand wrapped around the upper arm of a living Count Dooku, who was on his feet. straight-backed, and missing both hands at the wrist. Behind them both, Chancellor Palpatine stood in his red ceremonial robes with his wrists still cuffed, watching Obi-Wan find his bearings with an expression that read as relief, but arrived just slightly too late to be entirely convincing. Obi-Wan looked at Dooku. He looked at Anakin. He looked at the two cauterized stumps where Dooku's hands had been, and at the absence of a body, and at the specific quality of Anakin's posture, which was not the posture of a man who had just done something, but the posture of a man who had just decided not to. "He's alive," Obi-Wan said. "He's our prisoner," Anakin replied. "Can you walk?" "Of course I can walk." Obi-Wan got to his feet with rather more dignity than the situation strictly warranted and retrieved his lightsaber from the deck where it had skidded. "What happened?" "I'll explain later." "You'll explain now." "Later," Anakin said, and the word had a weight to it that Obi-Wan recognized. Not evasion, but triage. There was something else happening in the room that required both hands on the controls. And Anakin had made a decision about sequencing. The deck shuddered beneath them. A low, structural groan moved through the ship from somewhere below, the sound a large vessel makes when something load-bearing has stopped performing its function. That Obi-Wan understood perfectly. Later, he agreed, and ignited his lightsaber. They moved through the invisible hand in a formation that had not been planned and would not have been chosen under any circumstances Obi-Wan could have anticipated. Anakin at point with Dooku in arm's reach and a blade ready. Obi-Wan covering their rear, and Chancellor Palpatine between them with the mag cuffs still on his wrists, because no one had produced a release key, and this was apparently not the moment to look for one. The ship was dying in sections. Starboard corridors were already dark, emergency lighting casting everything in red strips that strobed when another impact tremor hit. Twice they rerouted around bulkhead doors that had sealed over spreading fires. Once a section of ceiling paneling dropped directly in front of them, and Anakin split it with a single diagonal stroke without breaking stride. What they did not encounter, past the observation deck, was organized resistance. The droid forces they crossed in the first two corridors were operating without coordination. Individual units executing standing patrol loops rather than responding to intruders, their command signal apparently severed at the source. Anakin dispatched 4 of them with the detached efficiency of a man clearing brush. Obi-Wan took 2 more at the junction to the central lift bank. Neither exchange required more than seconds. It was Obi-Wan who understood what the disorganization meant. "Grievous," he said, between corridor sections. "Gone," Anakin said, without turning. His command link cut out somewhere above the hangar level. When the ship started dying, he made his calculation. He glanced back once. He always does. It was not wrong, Obi-Wan reflected. Grievous was many things. Loyal was not among them. Dooku walked. He did not attempt to run. He did not attempt to lag. He matched the group's pace precisely, which Obi-Wan noted with the particular attention he reserved for things that seemed simple, but weren't. A man in Dooku's position had several obvious plays. Create confusion. Attempt an incapacitating force throw with whatever reserves he had left despite the injury. Use the Chancellor's presence as a bargaining chip. He made none of them. He walked, held himself upright through what had to be considerable pain, and kept his eyes forward. Obi-Wan could not decide if this was dignified surrender or something that required watching more carefully. He decided it was probably both. The hangar bay had 3 functioning craft. One was on fire. One had taken a cannon strike to the engine housing and sat at a 10-degree list that made its structural integrity a matter of charitable interpretation. The third was a Separatist shuttle of a mid-range class, functional, ugly, not built for atmospheric entry but capable of it under duress. The fourth docking position, a recessed clamp along the hangar's port wall, sized for a single-seat fighter, was empty. The clamp's release mechanism was still warm to the touch. Whatever had been there had not been gone long. Grievous's fighter, Obi-Wan said. Yes, Anakin said. That accounted for the general. A sharp, indignant series of whistles drew Anakin's attention to the shuttle's boarding ramp, where R2-D2 sat at its base, dome swiveling between the approaching group and the hangar's deteriorating ceiling, with the air of a unit that has been waiting longer than it considers reasonable. His photoreceptor, fixed on Anakin with a tone that communicated both relief and mild accusation. "I know," Anakin said. "Get aboard." R2 chirped something that did not sound like an agreement and rolled up the ramp ahead of all of them. "That one," Anakin said, already moving. "The hull plating on that model is rated for," Obi-Wan began. "I know what it's rated for. Then you understand my concern. I understand it, and I'm choosing that shuttle anyway." Anakin had already cleared the boarding ramp. "Get him aboard." Obi-Wan gestured toward the ramp with his lightsaber and looked at Dooku. "After you count," Dooku regarded the shuttle with the expression of a man whose aesthetic standards have been frequently offended by the necessities of warfare. He stepped aboard. The flight out of the invisible hand was not, strictly speaking, a flight. It was a controlled argument with gravity conducted by a man who understood gravity well enough to win most of the arguments. Anakin flew the way he always flew, with a physical intimacy with the controls that other pilots described as reckless and that results consistently failed to support. The shuttle bucked and shook as the invisible hand broke apart in their wake, debris skipping off the upper hull with sounds like thrown stones, and Anakin threaded the exit vector between two collapsing sections of the ship's superstructure, with approximately 4 meters of clearance on each side. Obi-Wan, in the co-pilot seat, watched the clearance readouts and chose not to say anything. Behind them, Palpatine had positioned himself on the portside bench with his cuffed hands in his lap. Dooku sat opposite him on the starboard side, restrained at the wrists with a secondary set of binders Anakin had clipped from a wall mount near the ramp, the kind used for cargo, which were not comfortable but were structurally adequate. R2-D2 had wedged himself into the narrow space between the forward bulkhead and the co-pilot console and gone quiet in the way he went quiet when he had assessed the situation and decided his primary function was to stay out of the way. The Chancellor leaned forward slightly. "The aft compartment," he said. His voice had recovered its warmth, its particular quality of sounding like counsel rather than instruction. "There's a damaged secondary reactor coupling back there. I could see the warning indicator from the ramp. If it goes, the explosion will be contained to the rear section of the ship." He paused. "The prisoner compartment." Anakin's hands moved over the controls. "I saw it. We should jettison the section." "I'm not jettisoning anything with a person in it." "Anakin, Chancellor." Anakin's voice was patient in the way that certain very sharp things are patient, flat, controlled. Not a natural patience, but a constructed one. "The coupling is venting plasma at 12% capacity. It's not going critical. I've rerouted the thermal load to the port stabilizer array, and we have approximately 40 minutes before that becomes a different problem, which is 20 minutes more than we need to reach the surface. The compartment stays intact." A pause. "I see," Palpatine said. He settled back against the bench wall. His hands rested in his lap. His face did what it always did. It arranged itself into concern, into the posture of a man who defers because he trusts, who retreats because he respects expertise rather than because his move failed. It was a very good performance. Obi-Wan had never had cause to examine it at close range before, at this angle, in this light. He found, watching it, that something very small and very cold had settled into the base of his thoughts. Not a conclusion. Not yet. A question that had not been there before, taking up residence without announcing itself. He turned back to his instruments. Across the compartment, Dooku had watched the entire exchange without moving. His eyes had tracked from Palpatine to Anakin and back, the way you track a pattern once you've identified the shape of it. He said nothing. The shuttle entered Coruscant's upper atmosphere and the hull began to heat, orange light building at the leading edges, and Anakin made 17 micro-corrections in the first 90 seconds of descent that kept them from burning in or bouncing off. And the city world expanded beneath them in all its impossible, luminous detail, and nobody in the compartment spoke. The silence had a different quality now than the silence on the observation deck. On the deck, it had been the silence of a moment suspended before its consequence. This was the silence of men in a small metal compartment, hurtling toward the ground, each of them carrying a separate understanding of what had just almost happened. None of them yet knew how much those understandings differed. The Jedi Temple at night wore a different face than the one the Republic knew. In the daylight hours it was a monument, 5 spires cutting against Coruscant's perpetual amber glow, ancient and deliberate. The kind of structure that made senators instinctively lower their voices when they passed it in their transports. At night, the lower corridors went quiet in a way that the rest of the city planet never did. No speeders, no commerce, just stone and recirculated air and the faint subsonic hum of the temple's own systems, old enough that the engineers who designed them had been dead for centuries. The detention level was 3 floors below the main archive. It had 6 cells. It had not been used in 11 years. Dooku occupied cell 4. He sat on the bunk with his bandaged wrists resting across his knees. The temple's medical droid had dressed the stumps with efficient dispassion, administered a nerve block that would hold for 6 hours, and left without speaking. And he looked at the middle distance with the focused quiet of a man doing serious interior work. Anakin stood outside the cell's energy barrier with his arms crossed and watched him. He had been standing there for 4 minutes. He was not entirely sure why. The debriefing with the Council wasn't scheduled until morning. Mace had been terse and clipped on the comm, which meant he was processing rather than reacting, which meant the session would be thorough, and Obi-Wan had gone to make his report and suggest that Anakin sleep, advice that they both understood Anakin would not follow. He had come here instead. Dooku did not look at him. Then, after another 30 seconds, he did. "You could sit," Dooku said. "There is a chair to your left." "I'm fine." "You've been standing in a guard posture for several minutes watching a man with no hands." A pause. "I am unlikely to overpower you." Anakin pulled the chair over and sat in it backwards, arms folded across the top rail. "Better?" Marginally, Dooku's eyes went back to the middle distance. "You want to ask me something, several things. Then ask them. I find the performance of disinterest exhausting at the best of times, and these are not those." Anakin was quiet for a moment. Through the energy barrier, the faint blue light turned Dooku's silver hair, the color of old durasteel. Whatever the nerve block was doing for the physical pain, it wasn't touching whatever else was working behind the man's eyes. "On the ship," Anakin said, "when you looked at him, what did you see?" Dooku was still for long enough that Anakin thought he might not answer. "What I should have seen 11 years ago," he said finally. "What I chose not to see, which is a different problem entirely, and one I am currently accounting for." "That's not an answer. It is the only answer I have that is true." He looked at Anakin directly for the first time. "Ask me something with a factual response, and I will give you one." Obi-Wan arrived 40 minutes later with 2 cups of something that was notionally tea, and the expression of a man who has just had a conversation he needs to process through additional conversation. He handed 1 cup to Anakin, looked at Dooku through the barrier, and sat on the floor beside Anakin's chair with his back against the wall. "The Council," Anakin said. "Mace is awake. Yoda is awake. The others will be convened by dawn." Obi-Wan wrapped both hands around his cup. "There's a complication. There's always a complication. The Chancellor's office has filed an emergency jurisdictional claim with the Republic Judiciary, Republic Intelligence Authority over enemy combatants, Senior Separatist Leadership Classification." He paused. "They want Dooku transferred to a RI holding facility by 0600. Anakin's jaw tightened. "That's 6 hours from now." "Yes, if he goes into Republic Intelligence custody, he won't come out," Obi-Wan said, with the specific quiet of someone confirming a thing they wish they could call an exaggeration. "Not intact. Possibly not at all." He looked at his cup. "The filing is technically within the Chancellor's emergency wartime authority. Mace is reviewing the Jedi Senate Accords to find the counter-argument. Yoda is being Yoda, which means he already knows something the rest of us will take another 3 hours to reach." Across the barrier, Dooku had listened to this without visible reaction. "You won't find a counter-argument in the Accords," he said. Obi-Wan looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "The Jedi Senate Jurisdictional Accords, revised in the 12th year of the current chancellorship. The revision narrowed the Jedi's custodial authority specifically, in cases involving designated enemy combatants of senior separatist rank." Dooku's voice was a professor's voice, precise, without emphasis, as though the information were simply information. "I know, because I reviewed the revision when it was filed." I understood it then as a mechanism for limiting Jedi autonomy in wartime intelligence matters. I did not fully appreciate, at the time, why that limitation might one day be relevant to my own situation. Obi-Wan stared at him. He wrote the loophole, Anakin said. Palpatine wrote the loophole, Dooku corrected. I observed it. There is a distinction, though I understand if you find it insufficient. He shifted slightly on the bunk. There is a path through. The Accords do not override the Temple's right to conduct an initial security assessment of any prisoner whose testimony bears on active threats to Jedi personnel. That provision was not revised. It is narrow, and it requires a specific framing, but it would give you until the Council session to begin a formal interrogation under Temple authority. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere in the Temple's depths, something mechanical cycled through a routine check. Obi-Wan and Anakin looked at each other. "Why are you helping us?" Anakin asked. Dooku considered the question as though it deserved consideration. "Because the alternative is a Republic intelligence facility," he said. "And because I have approximately 6 hours of useful consciousness before the nerve block fails, and I become significantly less coherent, and I would prefer to spend that time being heard by people with the capacity to act on what I tell them." He looked at Anakin. "And because you made a decision on that observation deck that cost you something real, and I find I am not indifferent to that." Anakin said nothing. "Also," Dooku added, "because what I know about Darth Sidious would end this war, and I have been waiting for the correct moment to deploy it for 3 years, and that moment has apparently arrived ahead of schedule." The name landed in the corridor like something dropped from a height. Obi-Wan set his cup down very carefully. "Say that again. Darth Sidious." No hesitation. No performance. Just the words, offered with the steadiness of a man who has decided on a direction and will not be turning back. The identity of the Sith Master who has orchestrated the Clone Wars from both sides simultaneously. I know who he is. I know his methods, his contingencies, his legal mechanisms, and a substantial portion of his financial architecture. He looked at Obi-Wan, then at Anakin. I also know that I have approximately 4 hours before he attempts to have me killed in this cell, so I would suggest we use the time efficiently. Anakin was on his feet. "Get Mace," he said to Obi-Wan, and there was nothing in his voice now that resembled the restrained, uncertain man who had stood on the observation deck 2 hours ago. This was the other register, the one that the 501st knew, the one that had carried 100 operations through situations that shouldn't have been survivable. Assessment, not emotion. A problem with a shape, and a mind already moving around its edges. Obi-Wan was already moving down the corridor. Anakin turned back to the cell. Dooku was watching him with that same scholar's attention, the same close, unhurried read. "Everything you know," Anakin said. "Starting from the beginning." Dooku settled back against the cell wall. The nerve block was holding. His voice, when it came, was the voice of a man who has rehearsed this account many times in private, who knows exactly which facts go in which order, and who has been waiting, with the particular patience of a person carrying an enormous weight alone, for someone willing to listen. "It begins," he said approximately 32 years before this conversation. Mace Windu arrived at Cell 4 with the expression he reserved for situations that had exceeded their expected parameters in directions he found professionally insulting. He stood at the barrier. He looked at Dooku. He looked at Anakin. He looked at Obi-Wan, who had the particular posture of a man who knew he was about to be asked why he hadn't calmed sooner, and had pre-constructed his defense. "You have 47 minutes before the RI transfer order becomes enforceable," Mace said. "Start." Dooku looked at him with the measured consideration of a man deciding how much preamble a given audience requires. He decided Mace Windu required none. "Darth Sidious recruited me 23 years ago," he said. "Not through coercion, through argument." He let that sit for precisely the amount of time it needed to. He was persuasive because he was correct. The Republic was corrupt. The Senate had become a machine for converting influence into legislation, and legislation into further influence. The Jedi Order, with respect, had become institutional in ways that prioritized its own continuity over its purpose. He looked at Mace. "You know this. You have always known this. We disagreed on the solution." Mace said nothing. His arms stayed crossed. His face stayed exactly where he'd put it. Sidious offered a different solution. Controlled collapse. Remove the rot through sufficient crisis, allow a stronger structure to emerge from the wreckage. I was led to believe, that I would be part of shaping what came after. The nerve block had maybe 5 hours left, and Dooku's voice carried no indication of the pain below it. I understood the rule of two in the abstract. What I failed to account for was its application to myself. He was going to have you killed on that ship, Obi-Wan said. Not a question. He was always going to have me killed on that ship. Or the one before it. Or the negotiation after that. A pause. The chosen one was within reach. I had served my function. The mathematics of the rule of two are not complicated. They simply require that one not apply them to oneself, which is a psychological failure I find I am not the first to make and will likely not be the last. Anakin was standing to Mace's left, not sitting, his arms at his sides. His face had the careful blankness of someone moving very large things around in a very small space. The financial architecture, Mace said. You mentioned it. I did. Dooku's eyes moved to the far wall, not in avoidance but in the manner of a man accessing a well-organized internal ledger. Sidious operates through 17 distinct financial channels, none of which are traceable to a single point of origin without cross-referencing at least 4 of them simultaneously. I can give you 11 of those channels with account designations. A forensic audit team with Senate Judiciary Authority, not Republic intelligence, they are compromised at the deputy director level, could trace the remaining 6 within a standard week. Mace's eyes moved to Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan's stylus was already moving. The inhibitor chips, Anakin said. 3 heads turned toward him. The clone army. He kept his voice flat, kept the thing that wanted to come through it contained. There are behavioral inhibitors in the clone's neurological architecture, installed at growth stage, designed to override volition on a specific command. He looked at Dooku. Tell me I'm wrong. Dooku was quiet for 2 seconds. In that silence, Mace went very still in the way large, powerful things go still when something has moved in their peripheral vision. You are not wrong, Dooku said. Order 66, Anakin said. The name of it dropped into the cell block like something that had been falling for a long time and had finally reached the floor. Dooku's expression shifted. The first genuine shift, beneath the surface rather than on it, and what moved across his face was not surprise but the particular discomfort of hearing a private horror named aloud in a lit room. Yes, he said. The command designation is Order 66. Its trigger is a direct transmission from the Supreme Chancellor's office, encoding a specific signal sequence through the GAR command network. Upon receipt, clone troopers in proximity to Jedi officers will execute them. All of them. Simultaneously, across every theater of the war. He looked at Mace. It was designed as the final insurance. If the Jedi moved against Sidious directly, he could eliminate them without deploying a single Sith agent. The corridor was very quiet. Obi-Wan had stopped writing. Mace's jaw had not moved. Nothing about him had moved. He was doing what Anakin had seen him do exactly once before, on Geonosis, standing in the arena with an outnumbered strike team, and a situation that had stopped being recoverable in the traditional sense, processing a catastrophic variable and converting it directly into tactical geometry without passing through the intermediate step of reaction. How many clones? Mace said. His voice was the same. That was the most alarming thing about it. All active GAR units. Approximately 1.2 million deployed troopers across all theaters. Dooku's voice remained precise. He was past the point where imprecision served him. The inhibitor is biological, not mechanical. It cannot be jammed. It can be surgically removed. I can provide the anatomical specifications. But the procedure requires individual surgery, and the window between this conversation and Sidious executing an accelerated timeline is not wide. He'll know we know, Anakin said. He will suspect within hours that something has shifted. He will not know the specifics. Dooku looked at him. He is very good at reading the shape of opposition from incomplete information. You should not underestimate the speed at which he will adapt. We're not underestimating him. Mace's eyes had moved to the middle distance in the specific way that meant he was running logistics behind them. We need the account designations, the chip specifications, and a written account of every meeting, order, and communication you can recall. Signed and sealed under Temple Documentation Authority. That will take more than 47 minutes. Then we need to buy more than 47 minutes. Mace looked at Anakin. The look carried a specific weight, an acknowledgement of something, and beneath it, a question about whether Anakin understood what he was being asked. The jurisdictional filing. If it were delayed in the processing queue, you want me to talk to Palpatine, Anakin said. I want you to be visible. I want him to see that you are still his Anakin, still the man who brought his prisoner home alive, and is now doing exactly what a loyal, slightly conflicted Jedi Knight does the morning after a complicated mission. He paused. Can you do that? Anakin thought about the observation deck, the voice behind him, pulling and pushing at once. The thing he'd felt in those 2 seconds when he'd turned and seen the mask resettling over whatever had been underneath it. Yes, he said. I can do that. Mace held his gaze for another moment, checking something. Then he nodded once and turned back to Dooku. The financial channels. Start with the ones connected to the banking clan. They'll be the cleanest thread for Senate Judiciary to follow. He pulled a chair from the corridor wall, set it in front of the barrier, and sat in it with the deliberate precision of a man who has decided to treat the next several hours as work, rather than crisis. Everything. In order. Don't editorialize. Dooku looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to name, not respect exactly, but recognition. One man built for institutional authority looking at another and finding the architecture familiar even across a decade of opposition. The first channel, he began, was established through a shell corporation registered on Arieu 14 months before the Battle of Naboo. Its nominal director was a customs official with no knowledge of its true ownership. Its actual function was the laundering of Sith operational funding through legitimate shipping contracts. He settled back. The nerve block held. His voice was even. The corporation's registered name and its controlling director's public identity I will provide to your forensic team as separate documented entries. They will not appear in any Republic record under Sith authorship, and their true connection to each other cannot be established without cross-referencing 3 additional channels. What I can tell you now is that the man who controlled them was known to me by one name alone. He looked at the 3 of them. Darth Plagueis. Obi-Wan's stylus stopped moving. Plagueis, he said. The name landed without any frame of reference. Not a legend he knew, not an entry from any archive he had read. Just the name, and the gravity Dooku placed behind it. A Sith Lord? Sidious's master, Dooku said. Dead, Sidious killed him as the rule of 2 demands, some years before the Battle of Naboo. But his financial structures were inherited intact. He looked at the 3 of them. Which means the money trail is older and deeper than you assumed, and the Senate's exposure to Sith financial influence predates the Clone Wars by at least a generation. Mace closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them and said, "Keep going." The sun came up over Coruscant the way it always did, not as light exactly, but as a shift in the quality of the haze. The upper atmosphere brightening from amber to a pale, washed-out gold while the lower cities stayed dark as it always stayed dark, the towers too tall and too dense for anything as simple as sunlight to reach the ground. Anakin watched it from Palpatine's outer office window, while the Chancellor's appointments secretary checked his name against a morning access list, and tried to decide how worried to be about a Jedi Knight showing up unscheduled at 0530. He was shown in at 0537. Palpatine was already at his desk. This was not unusual. In all the years Anakin had been visiting this office, he had never once arrived to find the Chancellor unprepared. There was always tea. There was always the particular arrangement of papers and data cards that looked like interrupted work but never quite seemed to diminish, regardless of how many times Anakin visited. There was always the warmth, deployed the moment the door opened, reliable as a climate system. This morning the warmth arrived with an additional texture. Anakin. Palpatine rose from behind the desk and moved around it. A choice. Anakin registered. Not a reflex. The man could have simply looked up. He chose to stand, to close the distance, to put a hand briefly on Anakin's arm in the manner of someone who has been worried and is expressing relief through touch rather than words. "I am so glad you came. I've been concerned." "I'm fine," Anakin said. You should have slept. Sleep. Palpatine made the gesture that meant he found the concept irrelevant when larger things were occurring. How is the prisoner? Secured, the temple medical team addressed his injuries. Anakin kept his voice at the register he wanted. Present, slightly tired. Carrying the weight of a long night without suggesting what the weight was made of. The council is convening this morning. Standard debrief protocol. Of course. Palpatine returned to his chair, settled into it, and poured a second cup of tea from the service on the desk with the ease of a man who had already poured his own, and simply extended the gesture. The jurisdictional transfer, I want you to know that was not my preference. Bureaucratic reflex, I'm afraid. The intelligence office files those requests automatically for senior Separatist captures. I've asked them to hold the processing pending your council's assessment. Anakin accepted the tea. Thank you. That's helpful. Of course. Palpatine's eyes stayed on him, not aggressively. The attention was warm, grandfatherly. The eyes of a man who cares more than protocol requires and has never been shy about showing it. You did the right thing yesterday, Anakin. I want you to know that I understand that even if, in the moment, I was not entirely myself, you'd been through an ordeal. I had, and I reacted from fear rather than from judgment. A pause, precisely weighted. But you held to yours. That is the mark of the man you are. Anakin looked at the tea in his hands. It was good tea. Palpatine had always kept excellent tea. He thought about the observation deck. He thought about Dooku's voice 6 hours earlier, 32 years before this conversation, and the 47 minutes that had become 3 hours and 20 minutes of recorded testimony, filling 17 data cards, currently locked in a temple archive access chamber under Mace Windu's personal seal. He thought about what Mace had said when they'd finally broken at 0400. He will be watching your face. Give him nothing to read. He gave him nothing to read. I wanted to ask about the trial process, Anakin said. Dooku is talking. Not everything, but enough that the Council thinks there may be actionable intelligence about the Separatist command structure. It would help to know what the Republic's timeline looks like, whether there's room for a full debrief before the formal proceedings begin. Palpatine's expression moved through interest, then consideration, then a kind of measured caution that landed as thoughtfulness. It was a very fast sequence. Anakin caught it this time because he was watching for the sequencing rather than the expression. The order in which the mask's components assembled. How much is he saying? Palpatine asked. Financial links, mostly, Separatist funding channels. Some command hierarchy, nothing that touches anything we didn't already suspect. Each sentence was technically true. Anakin had prepared them that way. Mace thinks if we can cross-reference with existing intelligence files, it might accelerate the tribunal significantly. A cleaner case. A cleaner case, Palpatine repeated. He nodded slowly. That does seem worthwhile. He set his own cup down with the particular deliberateness of a man whose hands he is being careful about. I'll speak with the Intelligence Directorate. Give the Council whatever runway they need. I appreciate it. Anything for the order. The warmth again. The hand raised slightly from the desk in a gesture that was almost paternal. Anything for you. Anakin stood, inclined his head, and left. He walked 6 blocks before he calmed Obi-Wan. The streets at 0600 were the closest Coruscant got to quiet. Delivery droids, early shift workers, the occasional Senate staffer moving between buildings with a datapad raised against the wind. Anakin walked among them with his hands in his robe pockets and kept his stride unhurried. He's pulling the intelligence filing, he said when the comm connected. Told me himself. Said he'd give the Council runway. Obi-Wan's voice came back immediately, which meant he hadn't slept either. He knows we found something. He knows we found something. He doesn't know what. Anakin turned a corner. He asked how much Dooku was saying. I gave him the version without the chips, without Plagueis, without the Senate financial exposure. He accepted it. Did he believe it? Anakin thought about the sequence of expressions. The order of assembly. No, he said. But he can't act on what he suspects without confirming it first, and he can't confirm it without alerting us that he's looking. He paused. We have a window. It's not a large one. The forensic team Dooku identified. Obi-Wan said. Senate Judiciary, not intelligence. Padme has a contact on the Judiciary Oversight Committee. I spoke with her an hour ago. You told Padme. I told her enough. She's been building a case against Palpatine's emergency powers expansion for 8 months. She was not surprised. A pause. She was angry, but not surprised. Anakin absorbed this. The knowledge of Padme, not surprised, sat differently than he would have expected. He thought of her across 1,000 conversations, in their apartment, in stolen hours, her voice making arguments he'd half listened to because the politics felt abstract against the immediacy of the war. He understood now that while he'd been fighting the war, she'd been watching the structure behind it. The judiciary contact, he said. How fast? She can have an emergency filing for forensic audit authority before the Senate opens its session. The account designations Dooku provided are specific enough that a single auditor could confirm the first channel within hours. Once the first confirmation lands, Obi-Wan stopped. Once the first one lands, the others follow, Anakin said. And confirmation changes what the Council can take to the Senate. It changes everything they can take to the Senate. The early morning haze had thinned slightly. Above the towers, in the gap between 2 Senate district spires, Anakin could see a strip of actual sky. Not orange, not amber, but something approaching blue. The color the sky actually was, when you got high enough. There's something else, Obi-Wan said. His voice had shifted a register. Not alarm, but the careful tone that preceded things he wanted to say precisely. Dooku gave me something this morning, before you left, after Mace stepped out. A pause. Names. Specific names. Senators on Sidious's payroll going back 11 years. Not all of them. He said he only knew the one Sidious used him as an intermediary to contact. But some of them. Anakin stopped walking. How many, he said. 14 confirmed. 7 probable. A beat. Anakin, 3 of them are on the Security Committee. 1 is on the Oversight Panel for Gar Command. The Gar Command. The Clone Army. The men who reported to the men who controlled Order 66's trigger conditions. The wind moved through the canyon of towers around him. He thought about 1.2 million deployed troopers. He thought about the inhibitor chips. He thought about the fact that they had been fighting this war for 3 years with an extinction mechanism wired into their own army, and no one, not Mace, not Yoda, not any of the Jedi who had commanded clones on 100 battlefields, had known. Get the chips, Anakin said. That's the first thing. Before the financial audit, before the Senate filing, before anything else. Get Shaak Ti to Kamino and get the specifications Dooku provided into the hands of someone who can start removing them. His voice was level. He made it level. 1.2 million soldiers stop being a liability the moment the hardware comes out. Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, something in his voice had changed. A recognition, Anakin thought, of the kind of mind that could hold grief and logistics in the same hand without dropping either. I'll contact the Council, he said. And Anakin, I know, Anakin said. He started walking again. Behind him, somewhere in the labyrinthine middle distance of the city, Palpatine was sitting at his desk with excellent tea going cold in his cup, running numbers that no longer added up the way they were supposed to. The window was not large. They would use every centimeter of it. The office emptied at 0800. Palpatine waited until the last aide had cleared the anteroom, until the outer door had sealed, and the ambient privacy field, the one that didn't appear on any architectural schematic of the building, the one installed by a contractor who had since retired to a colony world that no longer received HoloNet signal, had engaged. He waited another 30 seconds after that, because 30 seconds was what a man who had survived this long gave himself before reacting to anything. Then he allowed himself to think. The boy had come in carrying the wrong weight. Not wrong in any way that a recording would catch. Not wrong in any way that an aide or a Senate observer would register. The tiredness was real. Anakin never performed tiredness convincingly because he never understood why anyone would bother. And the tea had been accepted with the reflex of someone who has accepted tea in this office enough times that the action required no conscious processing. The deference had been present. The affection had been present. The fear had not. In every prior version of this conversation, and there had been many, in various configurations over many years, in many orbits of a relationship Palpatine had constructed with the same care he brought to any long horizon operation, Anakin carried fear he didn't know he was carrying. Fear for Padme, fear of his own darkness, fear of loss wearing the mask of strength. It saturated him. It was the medium through which everything else flowed. This morning it had been absent the way a sound is absent when you don't notice it until it stops. Something had happened in that temple between 0100 and 0537. He pulled up the jurisdictional filing on his desk terminal and formally withdrew it. This was already decided. The move had already been made in the room with Anakin, and reversing it now would cost him more than the filing was worth. He needed the boy's trust more than he needed RI custody of Dooku. RI custody had been an opening bid, not a commitment. What he needed was to know what Dooku had said. He keyed a private channel. It connected in 4 seconds. "I need a full audio reconstruction from Cell 4, he said. Everything from 0100 through current. Primary and backup temple security systems. The voice on the other end was careful and practiced. The temple's internal systems are Jedi administered. I'm not asking about the temple's systems. He kept his voice at the register that was not a threat, but that everyone who knew him understood as the room before a threat. The building's external infrastructure, power conduits, environmental monitoring, the waste processing network. Every system that interfaces with the temple's physical structure from outside its own administered perimeter." He paused. A longer pause on the other end. "We can reconstruct partial audio from the ventilation thermal sensors," the voice said. 40% clarity, maybe 60 in the lower corridors where the ducting runs close to the detention level. "Get it done. I want it within the hour." He closed the channel. He stood at the viewport with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at Coruscant the way he had looked at it for decades, not as a view, but as a board. The financial district to the southeast, where 17 carefully structured channels moved money through shells and subsidiaries and nominee directors toward purposes that would require a forensic team of exceptional sophistication to untangle. The Senate district directly below, where 21 individuals collected regular payments for the reasonable provision of information and procedural delays, and the occasional vote on an otherwise close committee matter. The Jedi Temple on the rise to the northwest, its 5 spires catching the morning light. He had always found the temple's architecture presumptuous. 10,000 years of institutional confidence expressed in stone. The Jedi's central failure, in his assessment, was the same failure that afflicted every organization that had existed long enough to confuse its own survival with its purpose. They had stopped being an order of warriors and become an order of administrators who occasionally remembered they were warriors. It had made them very easy to manage. Until last night, apparently, he pulled up a secondary terminal and opened a file he had not opened in 8 months. It was labeled, in his personal notation system, with a single character, a letter from an old alphabet that no longer appeared in common usage. The file contained 3 operational subplans, each built around a specific contingency, each capable of autonomous execution through channels that did not connect to the Chancellor's office in any traceable way. The first subplan was labeled Containment. It assumed Dooku's testimony was partial, that he had given enough to raise suspicion but not enough to constitute proof. It required seeding contradictory information through Republic Intelligence's public-facing channels, accelerating 3 pending Separatist engagements to generate headlines that would crowd out any developing story, and introducing a medical complication into Dooku's detention that would render him unable to testify in any formal proceeding for a minimum of 90 days. The second was labeled Redirect. It assumed testimony was substantial but limited to financial matters. It required activating 2 senators currently on retainer to call for an emergency committee review of the Jedi Order's detention authority, a procedural tangle that could absorb a significant period of Senate attention while quieter measures were implemented. The third was labeled Accelerate. He looked at it for a long moment. Accelerate had only one moving part. It required Commander Fox and a loyalty-vetted cell of the Coruscant Guard, a specific set of orders framed as counterterrorism rather than their actual function, and approximately 40 minutes of execution time. The result would be attributed to a Separatist rescue attempt. the galaxy's most wanted man, contacts within the criminal network, a security vulnerability in an undertrained temple detention staff who had never expected to actually use their cells. Clean, deniable, permanent, he thought about Anakin's face and the specific quality of its wrongness. He opened Accelerate. Commander Fox received the orders at 0912 in his office in the Coruscant Guard Administrative Complex, delivered through a channel that existed within the Guard's command infrastructure as a legitimate high-priority directive from the Chancellor's Security Office, and that Fox had used 4 times before in circumstances that had, each time, been framed as counterterrorism, and that Fox had, each time, not examined more closely than his orders required. He read the directive. He read it again. Target: high-value prisoner, Jedi Temple detention level, Cell 4. Method: incapacitation and extraction, to be reported as Separatist rescue attempt. Terminated upon resistance. Terminated upon resistance. Fox sat with the directive on his screen for a longer time than reading it should have taken. He was a soldier. He had been a soldier since the moment of his creation, which was not precisely the same thing as choosing to be one, but was the thing he was regardless. And in his experience, the distinction between a command and a correct action was not something soldiers were architecturally designed to sit with for very long. He thought about the 4 prior operations. He thought about what terminated upon resistance meant in practical terms, when applied to a prisoner in a cell who had no hands. He thought about the other men who would be on this strike team, 23 of them, all vetted, all drawn from the loyalty cohort, all carrying the same inhibitor architecture in the back of their skulls that every one of his brothers carried. He thought, if I ask the wrong question, I will not be given the opportunity to ask another. He thought, this is an order from the Chancellor's Security Office through a legitimate command channel, and I have followed this channel before. He thought, he has no hands. Fox authorized the deployment at 0931. He told himself, as he closed the directive, that terminated upon resistance was a standard protocol phrase, and that a restrained prisoner in a Jedi facility was unlikely to present resistance of a kind that would require its application. He was not certain this was true. He was a soldier, and certainty was not a thing soldiers were issued. He filed the strike team's operational parameters, logged the movement order, and spent the next 20 minutes doing paperwork with the mechanical focus of a man determined not to think about the thing he has just put in motion. In the Senate district, Palpatine returned the Accelerate file to its place, composed a brief note of gratitude to 3 senators who had supported a recent judiciary appointment, and poured himself fresh tea. In the temple in Cell 4, Dooku had finally slept. The nerve block had 4 hours left. The strike team had approximately 9 hours to move. The patrol schedule was wrong by 11 minutes. Anakin noticed it at 2140, standing in the corridor outside Cell 4 with a cup of cold caf and the specific alertness of a man whose body had decided that sleep was a theoretical position rather than an operational one. The temple detention level ran a 4-man rotation on a standard 40-minute cycle. He had been down here long enough to have internalized the rhythm without consciously deciding to. The footsteps, the soft click of the checkpoint scanner at the corridor's far end, the particular sound the east stairwell door made when it sealed. At 2140, the rotation was 11 minutes late. He set the calf down on the floor beside the wall and calmed Obi-Wan. Detention level, he said. Now, Obi-Wan didn't ask why. This was one of the things Anakin had always valued about him, the capacity to receive incomplete information and move on it, rather than through it. The comm closed. Anakin heard footsteps on the stairwell above within 90 seconds. He ignited his lightsaber, not fully, a partial ignition, just enough to put the blade ready in his hand without the glow advertising itself down the corridor. He moved to the junction where the main detention corridor met the east access passage and put his back against the wall and listened. The Force did not announce things. It did not send signals or provide narration. What it gave him, when he was quiet enough to receive it, was texture, a change in the quality of the space ahead, the way a room's atmosphere shifts when it contains more people than it should. He felt it now, coming from the east access passage. Coming down, Obi-Wan appeared at the stairwell door with his own blade already lit. Anakin held up 4 fingers, pointed at the east passage. Pointed down. Obi-Wan nodded and moved left, taking the secondary position at the junction's far side. They waited. The first man through the east access door was wearing Coruscant guard armor, the red and white variant, full tactical configuration, helmet sealed. He moved with the compressed efficiency of someone who had done this kind of entry before, weapon up. Sightline clearing the corridor left before he registered what the light source in the corridor was, and why it was blue. He stopped. The 7 men behind him stopped. Anakin stepped out of the junction alcove. "Safety's on," he said. "Weapons down. All of you." The point man's weapon did not move. Through the helmet's visor, Anakin could see nothing. Just the dark faceplate and the stillness of a soldier running a rapid calculation. The men behind him had fanned out in the corridor with the automatic spacing of a trained unit, which told him they were good, which told him this was going to be harder than it needed to be. "I'm not going to ask again," Anakin said. The point man fired. The bolt came fast and well aimed, a professional shot, center mass, the kind that didn't miss. Anakin's blade was already in the way. The deflection sent it into the ceiling and rained plaster dust across the corridor, and then Obi-Wan came around the junction from the left, and the geometry of the situation changed completely. What followed was not elegant. It was not the kind of fight that looked clean from a distance. 2 Jedi moving through a formation with the fluid inevitability of something that had been choreographed. It looked like what it was, 2 men trying very hard to hurt no one while facing 23 soldiers who had been issued orders and were executing them with the commitment that their architecture demanded. Anakin took the first 3 himself. Not a strike, a redirect, using the force to apply lateral pressure to their center of mass, enough to put each of them off balance and into the wall. The first hit the wall and stayed down. The second recovered faster than expected and got a shot off that Anakin, deflected upward while stepping inside his guard and pressing 2 fingers. To the junction of neck and shoulder with a precise nerve compression that the temple healers had shown him 3 years ago for field triage, and which worked, as advertised, in approximately 4 seconds. The third he took by the weapon arm, applied torque and put face first into the floor with enough controlled force to ensure the helmet absorbed the impact. Not dead. None of them dead. This was the thing that made it harder. Against droids you didn't have to manage the math of injury. Droids didn't have skulls or joints or the specific vulnerability of a being who needed oxygen and blood pressure and a functioning nervous system. Against these men Anakin had to fight at a constant threshold, enough force to remove each one from the engagement. Not enough to do the kind of damage you didn't come back from. The threshold moved depending on what each man was doing, how fast he was moving, what angle the engagement presented. It required attention. The kind of attention that normally went to threat assessment. Obi-Wan was working the same calculus on the far side of the formation. Anakin could track him peripherally, economical, precise, using the lightsaber to deflect rather than strike, using the force to displace rather than destroy. A man thrown against a padded wall with enough force to knock the air out could be picked up and walked to a cell afterward. That was the goal. The goal made everything harder, and Obi-Wan pursued it with the same calm ferocity he brought to every impossible thing. 12 men down in the first 90 seconds. The remaining 11 adapted. They spread the formation wider, split into 2 elements trying to flank, and the one who was clearly the unit lead. Something in his posture, the way the others oriented around him, pulled back toward the access door and reached for a secondary comm. Anakin crossed the distance in 2 seconds, used the force to pluck the comm from the man's hand before the connection established, and put the blade close enough to the visor that the plasma wash heated the faceplate. "Stand down," he said. "Tell them to stand down." The unit lead's breathing was audible through the helmet's filter. His hands came up slowly. "Stand down," he said to the remaining men. His voice was flat and clipped, the voice of someone following an order they have decided on rather than the order they came with. "Safety's on." Hands visible. The 11 men complied. Anakin stepped back. His blade stayed lit. Helmets off. All of you. They came off. 23 faces. Clone faces. His brothers' faces. the same face in 23 configurations of age and expression, and the particular tension that sits in a soldier who has just been stopped in the middle of a mission. Anakin looked at the unit lead. He was older than most, commander rank insignia on the collar, the specific weathering around the eyes that came from years of live-fire rotations. He was looking at Anakin with something that was not quite fear and not quite relief, a compound expression that Anakin recognized, because he had worn versions of it himself. "Commander Fox," Obi-Wan said from behind him, reading the identification plate on the discarded helmet. Anakin looked at Fox. Who gave the order? Fox's jaw moved. He looked at the floor. Something was working behind his eyes, the same arithmetic Anakin had watched him resolve in the wrong direction 9 hours ago, running again now from the other side. "The directive came through the Chancellor's security channel," Fox said. His voice was even. He had made a decision about evenness, standard high-priority routing. "I've received directives through that channel 4 times before. This was the 5th. What were the others?" A pause. "Counter-terrorism operations. 3 of them resolved without incident. 1 resulted in a casualty." He stopped. "I understood the casualty as collateral at the time. And now?" Fox looked at him steadily. "Now I'm standing in a Jedi detention level next to 22 men who were ordered to kill a prisoner with no hands, and I find I have a different understanding of the prior 4 operations. In Cell 4, behind the energy barrier, Dooku had not moved from the bunk. He had been awake for the duration, the combat sounds were not ambiguous, and he sat with his bandaged wrists across his knees and watched through the barrier with an expression that required more time to read than most. It was not relief. Relief was too small for what was on his face. Anakin had refused to kill him on the observation deck. And then again, tonight, in a detention corridor, had fought 23 soldiers with the specific and costly constraint of keeping every one of them alive. Dooku had spent 11 years adjacent to a man who treated every living thing as material. He had watched it so long he had begun to mistake the exposure for understanding. Had begun, in some cellular way he was only now diagnosing, to believe that the calculation was simply how power operated. He looked at Anakin Skywalker, 22 years old, exhausted, calf-stained, lightsaber still in hand, currently looking at Commander Fox with the focused attention of someone who has just decided that the soldier in front of him is not an obstacle, but a witness. Something that had been a long time calcifying in Dooku's chest chose this moment to develop a fracture. He did not show it. He had very good control. But it was there. The Galactic Senate Rotunda held 1,024 pods. At 0900 on a standard Republic workday, perhaps 200 of them were occupied. Senators and their aides conducting the ordinary business of a government at war. The chamber's vast central space mostly empty. The holographic displays cycling through committee agendas and procedural updates with the impersonal efficiency of a machine that had been running long enough to run itself. By 0930, the number was 411. By 0945, it was 870. The emergency session notification had gone out at 0847 through the Senate Judiciary's direct channel, not the Chancellor's office, not GAR Command, not Republic Intelligence. The Judiciary's channel, which carried a specific legal weight that the other channels did not. It meant a matter of institutional authority, which meant the kind of thing a senator's legal team advised them to be present for, regardless of how they intended to vote. Padme had written the notification language herself, in consultation with Bail Organa and 3 members of the Oversight Committee, who had spent the previous 6 hours reviewing 17 data cards under Temple documentation seal. The language was precise. It named no names. It requested the presence of all sitting senators for an emergency hearing regarding evidence of criminal conspiracy affecting the security of the Republic. It did not need to name names. By 0950 the chamber was full. Mace Windu entered through the Jedi delegation's reserved access point at 0955, with Obi-Wan at his left and 4 temple guards at his back. He walked the way he always walked in rooms that expected him to be smaller than he was, at his actual size, with his actual weight, not performing anything. The murmur that moved through the chamber when he appeared was not enthusiasm and not hostility. It was the sound of 870 political professionals recalibrating their mourning. He took the speaker's position at the central dais without preamble. "Senators of the Republic," he said. His voice carried without amplification. It always did. The Jedi Order has petitioned the Senate Judiciary for this emergency session under Article 14 of the Judicial Charter, which provides for emergency hearing when evidence of criminal conspiracy against the Republic's constitutional order has been obtained by sworn officers of the peace. He paused. We are invoking that article today. What follows will be presented as evidence, not argument. The Senate will draw its own conclusions. A pod to the left of center, the Outer Rim Coalition bloc, was already buzzing. Anakin, watching from the delegation gallery above, could see the body language of senators talking fast to their aides, the tight gestures of people whose assumptions about the morning had just been revised without their consent. The Jedi Order presents 3 categories of evidence. Mace continued. Financial, operational, testimonial. He looked at the chamber the way you look at a problem that has finally arrived in a form you can address directly. We will take them in that order. Padme presented the financial evidence. She had insisted on this in the pre-session meeting, with a specificity that had made Bail Organa raise an eyebrow and Mace Windu simply nod. She had been building a case against the Chancellor's emergency powers expansion for 8 months, longer than that, really, if she counted the private doubts that had preceded the formal research, and she understood the chamber's financial sensibility in a way that a Jedi Master, however formidable, did not. She knew which senators responded to numbers and which responded to narrative. She knew which coalition blocs had financial interests that the evidence would threaten directly, and which would feel the threat only abstractly, and she knew that you needed to land the abstract threats first. Get the senators with clean hands alarmed before you got to the ones who might need to calculate whether their own exposure was visible. She stood at the secondary presentation console and laid it out in the flat, procedural voice she used for committee testimony. Not passionate, not performed, just the information in its correct sequence. The 17 financial channels, the shell corporations, the nominee directors, the cross-referencing of 4 channels that had been confirmed by the overnight forensic audit. Confirmed, she emphasized, by a team operating under Senate Judiciary authority with no Jedi involvement, because she understood what that distinction would mean to the senators who distrusted the order. The financial legacy of a Sith architect whose structures had survived his death and seeded the Senate's exposure a generation before the Clone Wars began. She watched the chamber as she spoke. The disbelief arrived first, as she had known it would, the particular frozen quality of faces absorbing information that conflicts with a settled picture of the world. Several senators in the Chancellery bloc were wearing it. 3 of them, she noted, were not, and their faces told her something different. The tight blankness of people who are hearing confirmation rather than revelation, who are calculating exposure rather than processing shock. She noted their pod numbers without looking like she was noting their pod numbers. She would give those numbers to Bail afterward. The murmur began around the 4th channel's disclosure and built steadily. By the 7th, she could see senators leaning across the aisle to their neighbors. By the 11th, when she displayed the cross-referencing matrix that connected the shell corporations to 14 Senate offices and 3 committee chairmanships, the murmur had become something that the chamber's acoustics could not contain, and the presiding officer did not attempt to. Point of order, a senator from the core worlds called. His voice was tight. These allegations require independent verification before. The independent verification is the overnight audit, Padme said without heat, conducted by a Senate Judiciary team. The lead auditor is present in the gallery if the Senate wishes to call her to the dice. The core world senator sat back down. Obi-Wan presented the operational evidence. He was not Padme, and he did not attempt her register. He presented the inhibitor chip specifications, the Order 66 command designation, and a technical summary prepared by Shakti based on Dooku's anatomical documentation. A summary which confirmed, as of 0600 that morning, that the inhibitor's existence had been independently verified through examination of 3 clone troopers at Camino, who had consented to diagnostic scanning under Jedi medical supervision. He described the strike team operation of the previous night in the same flat voice he used for mission debriefs. He named the channel through which Commander Fox had received his orders. He noted that Fox was prepared to testify under oath. He did not editorialize. The chamber's noise by the time he finished had stopped being a murmur and become a register below coherence. the sound of a large room where everyone is talking and no single voice has achieved dominance. In the Chancellery delegation pod, Anakin could see Palpatine's representative, a senior aide, because Palpatine had not yet arrived, because Palpatine had not known the session would be called until the notification went out, and had spent the intervening hour performing the deliberation of a man deciding how to attend, rather than preparing whatever he was actually preparing. The aide's face was composed. His hands, on the pod's railing, were not. Dooku arrived under guard at 1008. Restrained, wrists bound, the prosthetic casings that the temple medical team had fitted over the stumps, which were not hands but provided a surface for the binders to work, and flanked by 4 temple guards in formal white armor. He wore his own clothes, which someone had cleaned and pressed overnight, and he walked into the Senate rotunda with his spine straight and his chin level, and approximately 870 senators watching him make the 40 meters from the access corridor to the secondary witness position. The chamber went quiet in a way it had not gone quiet for any of the preceding hour. He stood at the witness position and looked at the Senate. The Senate looked back at him. "Count Dooku," the presiding officer said, "you have waived your right to legal representation pending trial and requested the opportunity to address this body directly. Is that correct?" "It is," Dooku said. "You are advised that any statement made here carries full legal weight and may be used in subsequent proceedings." "I understand." The presiding officer nodded. "You may speak." Dooku turned slightly, not to the presiding officer, not to Mace Windu, not to the assembled senators. He turned until he was looking at the Chancellor's delegation pod, where the aide sat with his composed face and his trembling hands. "My name is Count Dooku," he said, "former Jedi Master, former Count of Sereno. I am the man who built the Confederacy of Independent Systems on the instruction of a Sith Lord who has held the office of Supreme Chancellor of this Republic for 13 years. The chamber did not make a sound. "His name," Dooku said, "is Sheev Palpatine." The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then it broke, and what came through was not the murmur of professional recalibration or the controlled noise of a body managing information. It was something raw. The sound of 1,000 years of institutional confidence making contact with the possibility of its own betrayal, and not yet knowing what shape the damage had taken. Padem, in the senatorial gallery, watched the coalition bloc she had spent 8 months studying respond in real time. She watched 3 of the 14 senators on Dooku's list attempt to leave their pods simultaneously and think better of it. She watched Bail Organa's face go very still and very focused. The face of a man who has been preparing for a moment, and is now inside it, and is choosing, carefully, what to do first. She watched the Chancellor's pod. The aide was on a comm. His composed face had not moved, but his body had. A millimeter of forward lean, the posture of someone receiving information and bracing against what it means. At the speaker's dais, Mace Windu stood with his hands at his sides and watched the chamber move through its sequence of responses with the calm of a man who lit a fire and is now watching it catch. Somewhere behind her, in the delegation gallery, Anakin was doing the same. The revelation ladder had been climbing for 4 days. They were near the top now. Below them, in the rotunda's vast central space, the Republic was deciding what it was. Palpatine arrived at 10:27. Not hurrying. That was the first thing Anakin registered from the delegation gallery. The Chancellor's pod extended from its docking position, and Palpatine stepped onto it from the access corridor with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who has chosen his speed carefully. He wore formal Senate attire, dark and austere, and his face was doing what it always did in rooms that required performance, composing itself into the expression most useful for the next 60 seconds. Concern. That was the selection. The furrowed brow of a man who has heard alarming things and has come to address them directly, who is troubled not for himself, but for the institution, who has walked into this chamber because transparency is what innocent men do. Anakin watched the pod extend to its floor position and felt nothing that resembled the pull he might have felt a week ago. No instinct toward the familiar, no weight of accumulated years softening the edges of what he was seeing. The relationship had a shape that he understood now. He could trace it from its beginning, see the architecture of it, identify each point where warmth had been deployed as a structural element rather than a natural one. He watched Palpatine survey the chamber and felt, with a clarity that surprised him with its cleanliness, nothing at all toward the man except attention. Below, Mace had not moved from the dais. "Chancellor Palpatine," the presiding officer said, "the Senate has heard testimony. I have heard what the Senate has heard," Palpatine said. His voice carried. It always carried. That was one of the things about him. The voice never needed assistance. And it carried now with the particular register of controlled distress. The sound of a man managing grief and shock through sheer force of public duty. "I came immediately. Whatever these allegations, however serious, I want this body to know that I welcome full inquiry. Complete transparency. These are extraordinary claims, and they deserve the motion before the Senate," Mace said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the quality of a wall. Palpatine's gaze moved to him. "The motion to strip the Chancellor's emergency powers pending investigation has been seconded by 43 delegations," Mace continued. "The presiding officer has recognized it for a vote. That vote was scheduled to proceed at 10:30. He looked at Palpatine across the chamber's vast space with the directness of a man who has simplified every variable in the room down to the one that matters. "You arrived at 10:27. 3 minutes. The chamber understood what 3 minutes meant. The murmur that moved through it had a different quality than the earlier ones. This one carried recognition rather than alarm. Palpatine had not come to submit to inquiry. He had come because he calculated he still had a move. Anakin came down from the gallery. He moved through the access corridor and onto the floor level at 10:29, taking a position near the base of the dais stairs with Obi-Wan, who had been there since the testimony ended, who had positioned himself with the specific premeditation of someone who had done the geometry of this room and decided where to stand. On the floor, the energy had changed. Senators in nearby pods had noticed Anakin's presence and were tracking him in the way people track things that might become relevant to their immediate safety. He was armored. His lightsaber was visible. He had not ignited it. At 10:29 and 40 seconds, the presiding officer raised the motion. Palpatine's hand came up. "Point of personal privilege," he said. The presiding officer paused. Personal privilege was a constitutional mechanism. It existed. It was legitimate. It could not technically be refused. It also bought approximately 3 minutes of floor time, and 3 minutes was what it was. "Granted," the presiding officer said. Palpatine turned to face the chamber. What happened in the next several seconds was not a physical change. It was a subtraction of performance, a deliberate, incremental stripping away of everything that had been maintained for this room and every room before it, until the voice that came out was the voice beneath the voice, and the stillness that replaced the concern had nothing in it that resembled the man who had poured tea that morning. The warmth ceased. Not gradually, it ceased, the way a climate system ceases when someone has switched it off, and the temperature of the room simply becomes what it actually is. Palpatine looked at the chamber, not at the senators. At the chamber. The way you look at a board. "You want to strip my emergency powers," he said. The voice was the same voice. That was somehow worse than if it had changed. The same resonance, the same carry, but evacuated now of everything that had lived in it. A tool stripped to its mechanism. Nothing more. "You want to hand this republic back to the committees and the procedures and the endless deliberation of 1,000 worlds that cannot agree on a trade tariff, let alone the prosecution of a war." He let the silence after that sit for a moment. "You would do this now, at the height of the Clone Wars, on the testimony of the galaxy's most wanted terrorist, and a handful of financial records that could have been fabricated by any competent intelligence service in the past 48 hours. The forensic team was Senate Judiciary," Padam said from her pod. Her voice was level, independent of the Jedi Order and independent of Republic intelligence. "Senator Amidala." He looked at her. What had always been in that look, the grandfatherly regard, the particular attention of a man who had known her since she was 14, was absent in a way that was not neutral. What replaced it was the attention of a man looking at an obstacle and assessing it. "You have always been a passionate advocate for constitutional principle. I have always admired that, even when your passion outran your judgment." Bail Organa's pod moved forward. The motion. Palpatine's hand came up, and blue-white lightning came with it. It did not arc toward Bail. It went into the ceiling above the central dais. A controlled burst, structural. The kind that brought down a section of decorative paneling in a cascade of debris that fell across the dais floor and sent the presiding officer back 2 steps and filled the chamber with the sharp, electrical smell of burned composite material. And, in the sustained blue-white glare of it, in the moment the dark side moved through him openly, without pretense, deployed at full extension for the first time in this room, his face changed. It was not gradual. It was the way ice fractures under pressure, a held structure releasing all at once. The lines deepened. The light that came from the lightning cast the angles of his face differently than any light in any prior room had cast them. His eyes, when the burst faded and the ceiling panel fell and the smoke began to rise, were the color they had always been underneath every other color he had ever shown. Yellow, ancient, stripped of every layer. Sheev Palpatine looked at the Galactic Senate. And the Galactic Senate looked back at Darth Sidious. The Senate erupted. Not in noise, or not only in noise. Pods retracted from floor position. Senators moved toward access corridors. Guards at the chamber's perimeter drew weapons and then stopped, because there was no clear target and no clear protocol for this specific configuration of emergency. Palpatine stepped off his pod. He descended to the chamber floor with the same measured pace he had used arriving, but the performance it was serving had changed completely. This was not the pace of a man choosing calm. This was the pace of a man who no longer needed to choose anything, because the calculations had simplified down to force, which was a register he understood better than any other. His lightsaber, crimson, ignited from a concealed position that no Senate security scan had apparently located, appeared in his right hand. Anakin's was already lit. He stepped forward and put himself between Palpatine and the dais, and the distance between them was maybe 15 meters of chamber floor, and in that 15 meters was the entire architecture of the manipulation, every private audience, every piece of careful counsel, every patient and warm and constructed moment of a relationship that had been built to produce exactly this: Anakin Skywalker, standing in this room, with this choice. He felt none of it pulling at him. He felt the force, clear and clean, the way it had felt when he was 9 years old, and it was simply the thing that moved through him, rather than the thing being managed and redirected by everyone around him. "It's over," Anakin said. Palpatine looked at him with the yellow eyes. "You are a child," he said, "who does not understand what he's ending. I understand it fine." Obi-Wan came around the left side, blade up, moving wide, opening the geometry. Mace came from the dais stairs, moving right. The triangle closed with Palpatine at its center. Palpatine turned in a slow circle and looked at each of them. The lightning came first. A full arc this time, not structural, aimed and sustained, splitting 3 ways simultaneously with the kind of power that required real fury to hold. Anakin caught his third on his blade. The deflection sent it into the floor and scorched a meter of marble black. Obi-Wan took his on his blade and was pushed back a step. Mace absorbed his through Vapad, taking the energy into his form with the particular ferocious geometry of a style that required a practitioner to be entirely honest with themselves about what darkness felt like. Palpatine surged toward Mace, the correct tactical read, because Mace was the most dangerous person in the room, and the most dangerous person was what you addressed first. And the duel between them moved fast and close and mercilessly technical, Mace giving nothing, taking nothing he didn't have to, the two of them working through a vocabulary of violence that neither of them had needed to fully deploy in years. Anakin hit him from the right, at the same moment Obi-Wan hit him from the left. Not a killing strike. A pressure strike. 2 blades forcing the guard in 2 directions simultaneously, a technique that worked only when both practitioners had the spatial awareness to execute it without hitting each other, which required either extensive training together or something closer to instinct. They had both. Palpatine's crimson blade moved to cover right, the stronger threat, Anakin, the one he couldn't ignore, and Obi-Wan's blue caught his wrist. Not severing. Forcing, the crimson blade hit the floor. Palpatine's hand came with it, the weapon spinning away, and Mace was behind him in the same motion with ancient Jedi Force suppression cuffs. not the standard binders used in the temple's detention level, but the ones from the Order's deep archive, built for exactly this, for the containment of Force users whose power exceeded standard restraint, and the cuffs closed. The lightning stopped. Palpatine's breath came hard. His eyes, yellow, ancient, stripped of every layer, moved across the three of them. They settled on Anakin. He said nothing. There was nothing in his face that resembled the man who had poured tea. In the chamber, the silence had the quality of a room that had been shaken, and had not yet decided whether the shaking was finished. Senators in retracted pods were visible through their transparent steel barriers, watching. Guards at the perimeter had not moved. The scorched marble in the center of the chamber floor still trailed thin smoke. Anakin deactivated his lightsaber. The blue light went out. Above them, through the rotunda's high windows, Coruscant's mid-morning sky was the particular shade it reached when the haze thinned. Not quite blue, not quite gold, something in between, the color of a city that had no experience of what it was now becoming. Mace looked at Anakin over Palpatine's restrained form. He did not say anything either. Some things did not require it. The duel lasted 9 minutes. Anakin knew this because he counted, in the way soldiers count things that are happening too fast for conscious thought to track. A rhythm kept somewhere below decision, in the part of the mind that stays operational when everything else is moving. 9 minutes from the first lightning arc to the suppression cuffs closing. 9 minutes to end something that had been building for 13 years. Or 32, depending on where you began the count. He stood in the scorched center of the Senate rotunda afterward, and listened to the building settle. Guards were moving now, Republic, not Coruscant Guard. The ones who answered to the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms rather than to any channel Palpatine had controlled. Medical teams were coming through the West Corridor for the senators and aides who had taken debris injuries when the ceiling section came down. Somewhere in the upper gallery, a woman was crying with the specific, uncontrolled quality of someone who had been holding something back for a very long time and had run out of the capacity to continue. Obi-Wan was beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Your wrist," Obi-Wan said finally. Anakin looked down. The lightning deflection had burned through his glove on the right side and left a stripe of red across the back of his hand that would blister by evening. He hadn't felt it during the fight. He felt it now. "I've had worse," he said. "You always have," Obi-Wan said. The words carried something in them that was not quite exasperation, and not quite pride. The compound tone that had characterized most of their relationship, and that Anakin understood. This morning, with an unusual fullness. He looked at his former master, and found him looking back with the same expression. They had time for it now. That was the new thing. Palpatine was processed through the Senate's emergency detention protocol by 1300, transferred to the Temple's secure archive level, the one that existed below the detention level, the one whose cells had last held a Sith apprentice 4 centuries prior, and sealed under a joint Jedi-Senate Guard arrangement that Mace and the presiding officer agreed on in 40 minutes of terse. Practical conversation that neither of them enjoyed, and both of them completed without incident. The Force suppression cuffs stayed on. They would stay on through the tribunal, which the Senate Judiciary agreed in emergency session would be conducted in public, in the rotunda, with full HoloNet access. This had been Padm's motion, and it had passed without dissent, which was itself a data point about how completely the morning had revised the chamber's political geometry. Dooku's trial was scheduled for 6 weeks later, in the same venue with the same transparency provisions. He received the news in Cell 4 from Obi-Wan, who delivered it with the directness that Dooku had come to understand was simply how Obi-Wan Kenobi operated. No softening. No performance of sympathy. Just the information in its accurate form. Life imprisonment, Obi-Wan said. The judiciary's recommendation. The Senate will ratify it. Dooku was quiet for a moment. Not execution. Not execution. He looked at his bandaged wrists, the prosthetic casings, the clean white wrapping, the place where his hands had been. He thought about the observation deck. He thought about 9 minutes in a Senate rotunda. He thought about a young man with a burned glove and a clear face who had decided, twice, that the line between what was right and what was easy was worth the cost of holding. "There is a property on Sereno," he said. "The Eastern Library. I want it transferred to the Jedi Archives." The collection is significant, pre-Republic texts, some of them unique. They should not remain in private hands. Obi-Wan looked at him steadily. I'll make sure it's noted. And the financial restitution, Dooku continued. My personal accounts, the ones not already seized through the audit, I want them directed to the Outer Rim Relief Fund, the worlds that bore the worst of the Separatist campaigns. He paused. It is not sufficient. I am aware it is not sufficient. But it is what I have. Dooku, yes, we'll make sure it's noted. Obi-Wan said again. And this time the words carried something additional that Dooku filed carefully, because he had learned, in the past several days, to attend more closely to what Obi-Wan Kenobi chose to mean by ordinary things. He settled back. Outside the barrier, the temple corridor was quiet. He had spent 11 years carrying the weight of a secret that had grown heavier with each year precisely because carrying it alone had been the condition of his survival. The weight was gone now. What remained in its place was not lightness. He was not so naive as to expect lightness, but something closer to ground. The sensation of a man who has set down a load and can feel the floor under his feet again. It was, he thought, enough. The Clone Wars ended in stages, which was not dramatic but was accurate. The exposure of Palpatine's control over the Separatist leadership, confirmed through Dooku's testimony and the financial audit's cross-referencing of Separatist command accounts to the same shell structures as the Republic side funding, created a situation in which the Separatist Council's surviving members faced a binary: continue a war that had just been publicly established as a manufactured crisis serving a Sith Lord's agenda, or negotiate. Most of them negotiated. Not all at once. Not without conditions, some of which were difficult, and without several further months of fighting in theaters where the local commanders either hadn't received the news or had decided their immediate tactical position mattered more than the strategic picture. But within 4 months of the Senate trial, 70% of active Separatist military operations had ceased under armistice agreements administered by a joint Senate Jedi Commission that Bail Organa chaired and that Padme served on, and that produced, over the following year, a framework for reintegrating the breakaway systems that the Republic's historians would later describe as the most significant piece of institutional architecture since the Constitution itself. The inhibitor chips came out of 230,000 clone troopers in the first 3 months, starting with the GAR units on Coruscant and working outward through the theaters in order of strategic concentration. The procedure took 11 minutes per soldier under general anesthesia. The recovery time was 4 hours. The clones who underwent it were told plainly what the chip had been designed to do. The conversations that followed were not easy. Some were very long. Anakin was present for several of them, sitting in medbay recovery rooms on Coruscant and later on Kamino, talking to men whose faces were his brother's faces. Who asked him questions he answered as honestly as he could about what had been done to them, and why, and what it meant now. He didn't have complete answers. He said so. He stayed anyway. Rex told him, one evening in a Kamino medbay when the ward was quiet, that the answer he'd found most useful was not the one about the chips, or the war, or the Sith. It was the one Anakin had given when Rex had asked why he stayed. Anakin hadn't remembered exactly what he'd said. You said because we're brothers, Rex told him. And then you sat there for another 2 hours. That tracks, Anakin said. Rex looked at him with the expression that clone troopers who had served under Anakin Skywalker developed over time. A compound of exasperation and something that didn't have a military designation but that functioned, in practice, as loyalty. General, Rex said. Captain, I think we're going to be all right. The Jedi Council convened a formal session on the first clear morning in what felt like a long time, autumn in Coruscant terms, which meant the upper atmosphere particulate had shifted, and the light coming through the council chamber windows was genuinely gold rather than the usual amber approximation of it. 12 seats in a circle. Sunlight on the floor. Anakin in the center. Mace spoke for the council. He did not make it long. The rank of Jedi Master, he said, is granted in recognition of demonstrated wisdom, sustained commitment to the Order's values, and the quality of judgment exercised under conditions of genuine difficulty. He looked at Anakin with the directness that was simply how Mace Windu operated in every register, including this one. The council is in agreement. Anakin received it quietly. He did not perform humility, which would have been dishonest, and he did not perform triumph, which would have missed the point. He stood in the sunlight in the council chamber and felt the weight of it settle, not as a crown but as a fact, the way all real things settle when they finally arrive. Yoda, in his chair, watched him with eyes that had watched a great many things across 9 centuries, and that carried, this morning, something that was not quite a smile, and not quite its absence. "Earned it, you have," Yoda said. "Long ago. Awarded it now, we do. The difference, remember." "I'll remember," Anakin said. He told Padme that evening, not in the apartment they had kept secret for 3 years, but in the open, on the terrace of a restaurant in the Senate district that she had mentioned once, months ago, that she had always wanted to go to but could never justify the exposure. He had made a reservation under his own name. It had not, as far as he could tell, caused any particular incident. She had laughed when she understood what he'd done. It was the laugh that reached her eyes, the one she didn't perform. They sat at a table in the open air with Coruscant spread below them in its full impossible density of light, and they talked for a long time about things that had nothing to do with wars or politics or any of it, about the places she wanted to show him on Naboo, about whether he could learn to cook anything other than ration components, about what a child of theirs might be like if the Force had any sense of irony. At some point the conversation simply stopped, in the way it does when 2 people have said enough, and the rest of it is just being in the same place. Anakin looked at the city. Somewhere in it, in the temple on the rise to the northwest, its 5 spires catching the last of the evening light, Obi-Wan was probably reading something. Or meditating, which in Obi-Wan's case was difficult to distinguish from reading. He thought about a corridor conversation 3 years ago that had not happened in this timeline. A version of himself choosing wrong and burning through every relationship that might have caught him. He felt the shape of the path he hadn't taken, the way you feel the edge of something when you've stepped back from it. The city breathed around him. He closed his eyes. Breathed, the Force moved through him the way it always had, when he stopped fighting the direction it wanted to go. Not dark. Not light. Just the thing itself, enormous and patient, and entirely indifferent to whether he understood it, which he had finally made his peace with. A galaxy and a chosen one, unbroken. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.